Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Bounty episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. As always, the Spot the Vuln solution will be on tomorrow's episode. And with that out of the way, let's get into some of our topics. So, first, we'll cover something that's been making the rounds on social media a little bit. A named vulnerabilities, I guess, a paper called Trojan Source, which is about the idea of hiding invisible, in quotes, vulnerabilities in source code as a backdoor. And this is based on the idea of using Unicode control characters to reorder tokens in the source code to make it so when the program is compiled or interpreted, there's a backdoor in the encoding that isn't visible if you're just reading the source code in a text editor or whatever. Because as they point out, compilers and interpreters adhere to logical ordering of source code, not the visual order. They note multiple techniques that can take advantage of this. One they layout is this idea of abusing comments to make comments that look like code in an editor. But those are actually going to be the comments look like code in an editor, but they're actually going to be interpreted as comments. Like they have this is admin example at the top of their page, and that's kind of what that is operating off of. There are some other tricks they use too, like using early returns and combining those with comments. So what appears to be a return in the comment is actually short-circuiting the code at runtime. And finally, causing parts of string literals to appear as code. So just some little tricks to fool anybody who might be reading the code in a text editor to think, okay, this code is commented out or whatever, but it turns out it's not when it's actually being compiled or interpreted. Um,
Yeah, like the main thing here is just it's largely I think they're all using the bidirectional characters, so like left to right, right to left. Just to indicate like, this next word is going to be right to left when everything else has been left to right or something like that. Not necessarily a novel idea, and I imagine we're going to start discussing that shortly, but on a whole, I mean, it's an idea I think has at least been around for a while in terms of the folklore of it. Like, just like, oh yeah, okay, we understand all the Unicode stuff. Like, there's always more tax error homoglyphs being, I think, a more popular one that we've seen and talked about a bit. Which is where you have like characters that look the same but are technically different bytes. In this case, they're using the invisible characters. Swap the order. Does the trick. It's an attack against the human. It's somebody reading it. They kind of push for fixing this in like the compiler, the interpreter here under defense. Talking about pushing this onto the compilers. I'm not sure I agree with that choice, or even just in the language spec of it being the language needs to fix this issue. It does feel, at least to me, more on the code editor. Um, like I could understand compilers saying no, a string, it can contain any characters that is proper. Um, the authors do actually suggest using escaped characters, kind of like you would escape a new line, which I think is somewhat of a fair compromise, but I do feel like this is just an issue more at the editor level and how it's displaying things rather than saying the compiler should actually reject this personally. I don't know. How do you feel about that, Spectre?
so I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that in theory, but in practice, there's so many different code editors out there that people are going to be using. Like people are using VS Code, Sublime Text, Nano, like whatever, right? And expecting all of those editors to kind of defend against this is maybe a little bit unreasonable. Whereas compilers are a lot more centralized. There's only like two or three compilers that people are going to be using generally for a given language. So while it might not be the compiler's fault per se, if you can mitigate it at the compiler, it's going to be a lot easier because there's less fragmentation when it comes to compilers and interpreters than there is when it comes to code editors. So I think it makes a bit more sense to try to fix it from the compiler and interpreter side, just because of that.
I mean, you're right that it would be less work to fix it at the compiler level because that is a centralized fix. And I'm big on centralizing the security. At the same time, like, it genuinely isn't the compiler's fault that the display is making this confusing. Oh,
Okay, but like
like, I get where you're coming from, and I do somewhat agree, like, if the compilers took action, I think that's great. Like, I'm not gonna say, like, compilers are safe to ignore it, but I do think it's fair to expect, especially for code editors, to show these invisible Unicode characters and make people aware that they're there rather than only interpreting them. I think same deal with, like, any of the zero space control characters. Just, showing them rather than or having the option to show them. Similar to how you can see white space, tabs versus spaces or something else. Like editors will show that. I think that is a fair feature for an editor.
I guess my question here is there a reason you wouldn't want a compiler to throw warnings or errors
No,
when
like I
there's
said,
unterminated, like there's no like real use case where you would have that, right? It's only going to be used in an attack scenario as far as I can think.
yeah, like I said, I think it's fine for the compilers to go and do that.
Yeah.
Like I have no issue with the compilers actually deciding to fix it. But I
I
could
ideally,
understand because I mean, there's no legitimate purpose that I can think of for it.
yeah.
But at the same time, you kind of just expect a string to be somewhat agnostic to what's inside of it. So it is a little bit surprised that there is this edge case because it can be exploited.
Yeah. I mean, ideally it would be fixed in the editors like you're saying, but I think you can kind of fix it on either end because ultimately the problem is like the desync there, with how it's being displayed and how it's being interpreted. So,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, I
I would
I
be kind of
agree with
fine
you.
with
It's
either
less
way.
work.
Yeah.
Um,
I just think the compiler and interpreter way is more practical.
yeah, I mean, it is. It's less work. It is in a sense practical, definitely. But at the same time, actually, Rudimo also mentions if this actually becomes a problem, I'd say separate code from data and allow ASCII code. ASCII only is something I've kind of thought about, and I mean, I'm sure we've all seen the memes with like Unicode variables and everything, and some craziness there. Does make it a little bit less accessible when it comes to international, like those who maybe aren't native English speakers. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's definitely some more practical trade-offs at the human level when it comes to making it ASCII only, but I feel like that is also perhaps a fair option. Although when we're talking about strings, UTF and or for all the emojis and stuff, like, those do get printed out. That does somewhat make sense too. So maybe I wouldn't quite back that one. I do want to shift topics a little bit though onto some of the drama around this. As I alluded to earlier, this isn't strictly speaking a novel or attack that nobody has heard of before. It has existed kind of in the what it hasn't necessarily been the best documented, but people have talked about this sort of thing before. Um, one of the examples here was going to say Peter S. I'm not even going to try to actually say his last name. Where he on Twitter here makes a comment, I'm sorry if you republish a 5-year-old attack and take 10K in bounties and refuse to even acknowledge previous reporters, you're an asshole. Oh, and he ends up pulling out like that. These reporters are should have done their homework. He actually makes mention in one of his posts here that they should have done more homework on it. I don't see it. Oh yeah, it's right here. The attack itself is not your original work. It was published before, and if you didn't do your homework, that's on you. I don't entirely agree with that, especially because his kind of proof here is the fact that he made a Go report or a report to Golang in 2018 about the same issue. 2017. I would not expect everybody who's writing a paper to go trolling around and like looking up every issue to realize somebody else reported this type of issue. I think there's definitely something to be said about the reporter who actually makes the attack known and popularized and makes it clear what the damages are. Now, he makes it clear what damages are here too. But the fact that, like, had he just asked about this and asked somebody to actually say, like, where has this been reported before? The fact that very few people would actually have a ready resource on it kind of makes it clear that they didn't go through the same effort to make the attack known.
So I guess I'll make a bit of a counter here with a different Twitter thread that came up, which was from Live Overflow. He posted a thread that he had some thoughts on the Trojan Source, website and their paper and everything. And he points out that Slither, which is a static analysis tool for smart contracts, is something they point out as like um, some evidence of previous techniques, right? They say, like, in one instance, a static code analysis tool for smart contracts, Slither contains scanning for right to left override characters. But
Yeah,
that wasn't mentioned in the prior work section. So it was a little bit weird. Like, Live Overflow was questioning here, like, was it maybe just a mistake that they forgot to put it in the previous work section, or was it intentionally left out as to, add more substance to that claim that this is a novel paper, like a novel attack. So yeah, I mean, here at least they do, like, they are obviously aware of previous research into this kind of attack and like a defense for it in the SAS tool. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of counters what you were saying there with, like, not, it's unreasonable to expect them to go out and be
oh,
aware of all these other reports. Like,
it's
here at
not
least they were aware of
unreasonable
that one.
for them to be aware of other reports. I'm just saying, like, this guy, when I saw the Twitter thread, he provided the one example, a 2017 Golang issue. As like, if this were a well-known attack, there had been presentations about this sort of thing or something, I would absolutely expect them to do the homework and be aware of that. But there comes a certain point where this, like, this language, they had that issue reported. This case with Slither is they're aware that something's looking for this sort of issue, but nobody's real, like, this is kind of the whole point of they've weaponized it or shown it's practical. That is somewhat novel work. Like, they've demonstrated exactly how you might go and attack this. That is something novel. Similar in the case where, going on the binary side, Malloc Maleficarium. The paper documented a bunch of attacks, and then more novel work was done with Malloc Days Maleficarium a few years later, which actually, made the attacks, I won't say more practical. It used the same attacks, but what it did was it laid out, like, here's some example code that's actually vulnerable. Like, that bit of effort is something novel. Now, I guess then that does challenge what they said, it's a novel attack versus just, adding something to it. Like, that is maybe a bit of a strong statement, especially when they're aware of something looking for it. But at least in the case with Slither, and I have not dug into this, seems like, as they mentioned there, it uses just swapping two characters as an example of it, rather than really indicating what the full issue here is with right to left. But it does indicate, like, they're aware of some sort of security issue there, or potential for a security issue. Um, so, like, there are some questions here. They might have been unintentional. I mean, if they were intentionally trying to mislead, then I also feel like they wouldn't have included they're in there if that was their intent. Like, I don't think this was maliciously done. I think it is kind of one of those cases where something existed, um, and this idea came, I think, was in the open source security mailing list. There's a bit of a discussion on the same point. One guy mentioned, there's this phenomenon of things appearing as like folklore that people don't find it worth actually writing down because everybody knows it. Everybody knows the attack. It's nothing novel. And then somebody comes out and writes down the obvious thing and make sure, like, as I was saying earlier, makes people aware about it and actually warns them about it. They kind of deserve the credit for actually making people aware of it if nobody else bothered to other people in that way. Like, I
Yeah, so
kind of agree with that sentiment.
I guess that's the real question is, like, do you think there's value here in having this formalized? And if you do, then maybe you're a bit more favorable to the paper. If you're one of those people that's like, well, it's already known about, you don't get credit for just writing it down, then obviously you're going to have a problem with it. Um,
Fair point.
Beyond that, I think they do try to make it seem like a bigger issue than it actually is. So I'm going to refer to their abstract here, which is in their paper. Um, and in their abstract, they say that we present a new type of attack, which, okay, it's not really new, but we kind of already covered that. Um, and they go on further to say that the Trojan Source attacks, as we call them, pose an immediate threat both to first party software and of supply chain compromise across the industry. And there's been some contention on that point of there being an immediate threat or like this impact being huge. Because like some people have pointed out, like this is a fairly visible attack. Like you can see the patterns that they have to use to exploit this with using like comments in line and whatnot. And if I saw that code and I was doing code review, I would be very suspicious of it. Like just having commented code in the same line as actual code like that's a huge red flag.
They do have the
And on
example of
top of
a
that,
line comment though, where it looks like it's just like a double slash at the end, rather than it being the admin example where it's the multi-line comment that's only one line and in the same line as code. I agree with you there. They're definitely playing this up.
yeah.
Almost every named vulnerability is playing it up. And we've had that discussion quite a few times over whether or not something is actually worth being a named vulnerability. And I actually, and this is a case where I think it is, maybe worth giving it a name. I don't know about Trojan sources and stuff, but it's going to make it more convenient to speak about, and it is something you would kind of need a more user-facing name. At the same time, this is going to be more targeted towards developers, so it's saying like RTL, LTR characters or Unicode character-based tax, whatever, something like that. That really a crazy idea either? Not at all. They're definitely playing it up. I agree with you there. I just don't think it's necessarily um I don't think it's malice on their side for trying to hide previous report. Um,
Yeah, so I will say, like, I do think people are being a little bit harsh here, because, like I said, I think personally there is some value in formalizing it, kind of along that lines of spreading awareness and spreading it to people who might not be aware of like the folklore, as you mentioned earlier. But
I mean,
with how
it
much they're
feels a little
playing it up,
bit.
it does rub me a little bit the wrong way with how much they're playing it up and trying to um like I can see why people think they're trying to take credit for other people's work here. Like I can kind of see that as well. But on the other hand, I do think people are being a little bit too, you know, upset about it, I
It's
guess.
it's kind of academia too. It reminds me of like some of the side channels we've covered, where they'll play it up as like some crazy new side channel that's super impactful. You know, my favorite example to go to is the monitor brightness. So if you have a camera pointed at a monitor that's displaying sensitive or that has access to sensitive information, you can cross an air gap network through the monitor's brightness by sending, a bit based off of how bright the monitor is at a certain point. Was that like a crazy attack? No. I mean, it was maybe even a novel, or was it was maybe even not novel because somebody had thought of that before, I'm sure of it. But they were the first kind of document and they do get something for that in terms of the academic writings. But at the same time, yeah, if they're overplaying it, that's kind of common in academia. I don't think that should be the case. I'd want to see some changes around that, but I don't think this is the hill to die on.
Ultimately, what a lot of this drama just highlights and calls out is this clash between academia and security researchers. It just seems for a while like this is kind of the most prominent example right now, but there's been others where it's just like academia is really weird in the way that papers are try like people try to write papers to try to get them into conferences and whatnot. So it's kind of in their best interest to try to fluff it up a bit and make it sound like it's more novel and unique than it perhaps is. Um, And it's kind of a weird wording because, in the sense of academic papers, maybe it is novel and unique. Maybe it hasn't been documented before, which, like we said, kind of has value. But if it's known about by other people, that's where there's just kind of clash. So it's not something that's going to go away. We're definitely going to see, something like this pop up again where people are angry about something that comes out of academia. And I think it's just this like cultural difference between what happens in academia and what happens in, non-academic security research. It's just kind of a clash between ideas there.
And that does also remind me here of the Peter S. guy that I mentioned. He opened an issue on the Trojan Source's GitHub here. The attack is known, not novel. Shows his case of it.
He
And
seems to be a little upset.
yeah, I feel like he feels like he got shafted on there because he's reported this previously. And in his particular case, like, I don't think it's fair to expect them to have noticed every language report. We've had more things come out. That live overflow thread does link to one that actually links to several other cases. I think one of the oldest cases of this is actually, we can only tell from the title of it. I want to say it was in like Mozilla Bug Tracker, maybe. Actually, I think it might be linked here in this thread. Yeah, this bug here, Eclipse Bug Tracker, bidirectional misleading display of bidirectional strings in 2011. Which, is definitely going back. We don't actually have access to the bug report, or at least I don't. Maybe if you register, you're able to see it. It does say you need to log in. I didn't bother trying. But, there's a reference to this sort of attack going all the way back to 2011. So, like, it's been around for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, they say it seems to be private, I presume, because people start commenting and contacting. So, yeah, I mean, that the private aspect changed somewhat recently. It was private when I first looked at it. Yeah, I
And
mean,
again, like that kind of highlights like the fact that that bug was private for a while. Like it just kind of hints towards that idea that documenting it is valuable. But
well, it
yeah,
was
I mean, we've
public
already.
until it sounds like it was public 7 days ago when this guy made.
Oh wait, okay, sorry, I misunderstood you. I thought it was private and then made public, but you're saying it was public then made private.
That seems to
Um,
be the case. Yeah.
that's really weird.
Well,
But
it seems
okay,
like people probably start commenting on it and complaining and getting involved in the drama.
yeah, they probably just wanted to lock out
Yeah.
all the drama or whatever, which makes sense. Okay, but
But
yeah, I
the
mean,
reason I brought this up, sorry,
yeah,
cut you
go
off
ahead.
there. The reason I brought this thread up is because the author of the paper, Nick, mentions we'll leave this comment here for GitHub reference included with the history of this uh technique. So it sounds like they're probably not rewriting their paper over it, but they're not trying to like bury it or hide this information either. And this was 7 days ago, I think, as it was maybe blowing up or a little bit before.
Hmm.
But I mean, it sounds like they're not trying to bury this information. At least to me, it sounds like this was probably more of a genuine thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good call out on your part on them not being malicious. I think people are being a little bit disingenuous by trying to insinuate that like, oh, they're just cynical people. They're just trying to, you know, get something under their belt for things other people did. Like, it seems there is like a good intent here, and I think that's important to point out. So, yeah, fair call out there. Where I'd leave my thoughts on it is it's just it's good to document it, but it's being overplayed a bit. So I think there's kind of silliness on both sides, I guess. Is there anything you wanted to add there, Z, or do you want to move on to some of our exploits?
No, I think we can move on. We've spent enough time on this one.
All right, cool. So, first for our vulnerabilities in actual software, we have a post from Sonar Source on 2XSS in SmartStoreNET, which is an open source e-commerce platform for .NET that supports PB code. I mention that because that will be relevant for talking about the issue. So let's get into what the issue actually is. So first of all, it goes into some detail about how private messages are formatted and constructed, um, noting that it'll take text and it will HTML encode it in an attempt to prevent something like XSS, like they don't want dangerous characters to get through, which is good. They have some sanitization there. But they do support BB code, which does create HTML that gets mixed in with the plain text. And this is where the issue comes into play. For example, one of the things you can do in BB code is use URL tags to create a hot link on some text. And it's possible for you to pass an attribute to that or no attribute in the tag. So you can just have URL tags around a regular URL, make that a link, or you can pass a URL attribute and then have that attached to some other text that then gets linked, right?
Yeah,
Somewhat
so to
common
be
feature.
clear, it's the href attribute that you're able to control. So you do like either square bracket URL, and square bracket, and then like your link, and it'll just make that clickable. Or if you do URL equals, you can set the href attribute to whatever link you want to go and have different text showing. So it's
Yeah, exactly.
specifically that one. It's not arbitrary attributes.
So this case makes it kind of interesting because what happens if you get really creative and you try to create a URL tag with arguments inside of an existing URL tag without arguments? Well, the way that the regex replace works when it tries to format that BB code into what's finally rendered on the screen, um, the anchor code for the second replacement ends up closing the quote for the href of the first anchor tag, which does give you the ability to inject arbitrary attributes into the anchor tag of the first URL, which is enough to perform cross-site scripting. So what happens here is what's coined as a sanitize then transform pattern. So they kind of had the right idea at first, trying to sanitize it, but then because of transformations made when parsing the BB code, it kind of reopens the door to being able to XSS.
Yeah, I
Um,
think in this case, like it's interesting in my opinion, just because of what really seems to be going on here with the nested BB code. Like nested BB code is fairly common, and generally this wouldn't be an issue. Like they would still be protected, except for the case that the value that's nested ends up in an attribute of the tags. In almost every other case, when it comes to BB code, you don't have control over any of the HTML attributes. It's, use like B for bold, drop in your strong tags or, underline. Like it'll drop in complete tags around it or headers, whatever. The tag, the value. It's only because with the URL here, you end up controlling that attribute, um, that you're basically able to then inject a quote that isn't escaped properly because it's not considering the actual it's not considering the context of where it's being reflected. So I thought that was an interesting case for this one. Rudamal mentions LOL. I found the exact same bug some 10 years ago. Yeah, I do remember seeing this sort of bug, like this sort of nesting. This is a reasonably, I'll say reasonably common. I feel like I haven't seen it in a while, but yeah, like it's not going back on the idea of novel techniques. Like it's not a novel technique. Looking at how things get nested matters and is something that you should always be testing for and kind of aware of, because that is those interactions are where you can have the edge cases that lead to these sorts of bugs. This one in particular is just because of the fact that usually you don't need to worry about attributes, just tags being wrapped around it. That's the normal situation. Um, this particular case has it attribute, therefore we're able to create this.
so this can be taken advantage of in two different places: private messages and forum posts. Both cases are dangerous. In particular, they call out private messages as a means of being able to, PM admins or something and hijack their accounts using a malicious payload. Then that can be taken further to install malicious plugins to get code execution on the server. As such, the rest of the post focuses on exploiting the private messages scenario specifically and how they constructed a payload for that, which abused the on WebKit animation end attribute and the fact that font awesome, which is being used by SmartStoreNET, is used and will use CSS animation. So just kind of abusing the fact that the WebKit animations are used, specifying a callback on that, then does their malicious action of
Yeah, and
installing
I
a
thought that was a
plugin.
cool technique too, just because I mean, usually when you have attribute injection in a tag or your anchor URL links, um, usually you're left with things like on mouse over. So if somebody mouses over the link, then you'll get the JavaScript executed. I'm sure this isn't their technique game, but I at least I at least haven't really seen any write-ups, or at least we haven't covered this particular technique before for using the animation end as a way of getting automated code execution. Getting it to run basically on load because that animation will happen on load because injected, the first they injected the style attribute to actually set the animation, and then they can get on animation. That I'm not sure if on animation end works on Firefox, but on WebKit animation end does work on Chrome and of course Safari being WebKit, and Opera. So on WebKit animation is still pretty wide reaching, not specific to WebKit.
Yeah, it's a good thing to point out. Um,
After that, the rest of it was just what can an admin do? They can create another admin customer. They can install a plugin for code execution.
yeah. So the way these were fixed was to add sanitization on the final processing before rendering the message in both private messages and forum posts, which they do using the HTML sanitizer library they already used before, just doing another pass of it, basically. Um, Something a bit weird I thought I'd point out. They mentioned that SmartStoreNET has no plans to make a release that has this issue fixed, meaning while technically this did get fixed and acknowledged, anyone using SmartStoreNet would have to do a new build from source to be protected from it, which is kind of significant because let's be honest, like how many people are actually doing that? How many people are going to be, pulling the latest source of SmartStoreNet and building it? Probably not many. So this is kind of a weird situation where it's fixed and like the vendor acknowledged it and everything, but this could be found in like quite a few areas like going forward, because it's just the security and updating isn't really centralized. It's kind of up to the people deploying it to make sure they're protected against it. So yeah, I thought
Yeah,
I'd
I'm
call that
not.
out because they just quickly mention it towards the end. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
bit
I
weird.
kind of agree with you. At the same time, I don't know what their update process usually ends up looking like. In
Yeah,
terms of like one, how often things go out, but also just in terms of how it's being used. Like if people are just generally checking out the source or having just using the repository as their update stream. 'Cause that's definitely possible. Or they might be using the tagged release in this case. Kinda think they should because it is security sensitive. Yeah, I
yeah. So
mean,
I mean,
I
the way
just
that they word the summary, I think it is likely that they have like the tagged releases, and they just didn't want to do one for the security fix, which I think
yeah,
isn't
they do.
isn't great. But
I'm looking at their repository now, and it's actually a little bit weird. Their last release was January 2021, so January of this year. And then I thought like, okay, and then before that, November of 2020. So it looks like yearly release. And I keep scrolling, and it's like, nope, they have some in October of 2020 and July. Um,
it's just
it,
like this year where the updates kind of cut off. It seems.
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what the
Um,
backstory is behind that. But
yeah. So I
yeah,
mean, that's unless they're just well, I mean, they're clearly still maintaining it. Yeah, I mean, this smells like fishy to me as to why they're not doing the update on it. Um, Especially it's been long enough that I'm sure there are enough fixes to warrant a new release or at least a new point release for it. It's a security issue. Yeah. I looking at this, I don't know what more reasoning they have, but I definitely think it should have been updated, or at least done as a proper release.
yeah. Overall, though, like you said, I kind of like that idea of using the WebKit animation end. I think that was probably the coolest part of the post for me
Yeah,
because
that
the
was
vulnerabilities were somewhat, well, it's kind of interesting as far as XSS goes, but um,
yeah, I mean, we've
yeah,
seen deeper access, but on WebKit animation, that was at least somewhat new to me. I feel like I've probably seen that on like OWASP or something and just read it in passing while looking for a way to escalate an issue, but I mean, had it laid out. Yeah, good post.
yeah. So continuing the XSS train, we have another XSS in Chrome. This one's a universal cross-site scripting bug in the new tab page. Specifically, it's in the past searches listing or the uh, suggested searches listing of the Google search bar. Very straightforward as far as XSS goes. there's just no sanitization. So the payload is literally just a closing tag and then an image with an on error equals alert. Um, they assume basically the problem is here that they assume suggestion answers contain HTML markup and they account for that when they're generating the ARIA label. Um, Now, to take advantage of this, it does require that you somehow get a malicious past search result into a victim search bar, which weirdly enough, they imply this can be done through CSRF, but their POC contains a CSRF token, I believe, which would imply an attacker would also need that token to be able to take advantage of this. So it's not entirely clear of like how practical this attack would be necessarily.
Yeah, I didn't
Um,
try and reproduce it. It does seem like there might be some extra barriers. Fortunately, it looks like Google Drive just isn't loading the HTML file here too nicely. Um, did have it pull up the code before. Of course, now it's not. But yeah, I mean, they had the CSRF for that, or for the search itself, required that in there. So I'm going to say, like, it's questionable over how you're actually going to exploit this. It's an interesting vector, though, just because I could understand why a developer might not really be thinking too much about, like, oh, this prior search, like, yeah, there's not going to be access there. Like, it's an interesting vector to attack. Hard to get access to, like, even with the CSRF. Um, since this is just on the new page, requires like user interaction to actually go click onto the search bar of their new tab page rather than just search. So at least for me, if I'm going to do that search, I'm going to do it in the URL bar itself. I'm not like opening a new tab and then going to the search bar in there. So I feel like most people just aren't really at risk with this one anyhow. So maybe I'm just generalizing too much based off of my use pattern. But like, I don't know. I thought it was still an interesting location to have here, for an issue.
Yeah. That said, I don't believe that new tab page is like a special page. Like we've talked about some issues before in like Chrome and whatnot that um there's certain pages like the settings page or whatever that has special privileges. Like they can access the file API, for example. I don't believe that the new tab page falls under that category. So
Yeah, I didn't
uh,
look into it, but nothing was mentioned in the comments here really giving it. This got them a $1,000 bounty, I think.
yeah.
So not huge. If it got like code execution, I'd have imagined it would have been a much higher bounty.
Yeah. So given the fact that it doesn't seem like you're gaining a more privileged context and you might need a CSRF token to even take advantage of that, the impact here is a bit low. Nonetheless, it was a bug. They fixed it. Like Z said, they paid out $1,000 for it. Now what they do is they just assume suggestion answers are text and they don't allow markup. Simple as. So yeah, I mean it's a little bit surprising, as it always is when you see kind of these like trivialish bugs in what is a commonly used, like the new tab page is pretty commonly used and it's in Chrome, which is like has the biggest market share of browsers. So it is kind of surprising to find this kind of issue in Chrome in 2021, but you know, um we've talked about issues like that before. Something funny, it's not really too relevant to the issue, but something funny that was happening uh in the issue in the tracker was this wasn't actually set to be published or made public as early as it was. They were kind of pressured into making this public earlier because they were getting a bunch of duplicate reports for this exact same issue. And they were getting so many of them where they were like, okay, we just got to publish this to make it known. Like, yeah, we're aware of this issue. Just thought that was kind of funny that there was so much collision going on there. But like I was just saying, given that it's kind of a trivial XSS and it's used in a commonly used component, it kind of makes sense there was a collision there. But yeah, it just gave me a
Yeah,
bit of a
then
chuckle when I was reading through the comments.
I kind of wonder how long it was actually there before they started getting the.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that too, because it seems a little bit weird that like this report was made September of this year. So like it seems weird that all the collisions would have been happening within the last like month or two.
Unless it was just
So
recently introduced. Is
yeah,
kind of the key
it
thing
might be
there.
that you would have to go commit surfing and do like a root cause to figure out which patch would have introduced it or whatever, which we haven't done. But um, yeah, that's an interesting point to bring up. Maybe it was recently introduced. So, but can't say for sure. But yeah, we'll move on to a HackerOne report for a StreamLabs vulnerability. Um, this one is another pretty simple vulnerability. Basically, StreamLabs had an endpoint global identity, which would take an R argument for where to redirect a user, and it would redirect with the user's access token sometimes. Now, this was whitelisted. You couldn't just pass in like any URL you wanted for the redirect. Um, but the problem is their whitelist was a little bit too expansive, and they had some domains in there that were no longer owned and were up for registration. So yeah, an attacker could just register that domain and take advantage of that open redirect to do something malicious with the user's access token. In this case, Dragon's Lair with dragon spelled with a Y. Dragonslair.live was the URL in question that was available for registration, but I believe there were at least one or two others in there too that they pointed out could be registered and could pull off the same attack. A little bit of a weird issue because most of the time when you see whitelisting happening with open redirect, they're like we've seen it before with JetBrains where they had to kind of take advantage of a different issue on the site to chain with it to make it useful. Um, I don't know if I've really seen one where it's just like they have this whitelist with a bunch of stuff in it that just hasn't been used and
Yeah,
it's available
so
for
part of
registration. A little bit
the
weird.
part of the reasoning there though is when we talked about with the JetBrains example, that was it was taking advantage of the fact that's kind of an open redirect to right? Whereas this isn't really an open redirect because it is all whitelisted. JetBrains, they had an open redirect. That's how they were able to get a link that existed on the JetBrains domain, or it was one of their subdomains or like some other area, but they had a link that was existed there, so the domain was still whitelisted, and then they'd use that to get it out. That's kind of just attacking OAuth. This one, I mean, this feels still like it's probably some sort of OAuth setup where it's just sending the token over. I thought it was interesting the fact they call out simply using Wayback Machine to find other URLs that have been approved there. Because that's how they found the white some of the domains that were whitelisted. Is what URLs have we seen on Wayback Machine that provided or were provided here as a redirect parameter. So just a good example of using that open source intelligence a bit to figure out, what attack surface is there. Are any of these domains still available and haven't been removed from the whitelist? But yeah, in this case, it's just it's kind of a different attack. This isn't exactly OAuth, so it didn't take as much of a complex attack to deal with. Like it's different from those OAuth attacks that we've talked about, I say. And thus
Yeah, like you said though, that was a clever like strategy. So yeah, I thought that was cool.
and I don't know if you
So
called it out, but $200 bounty for us.
yeah, I was just about to get there. So um,
Well,
but
beat you
yeah,
to it.
damn it, Z. It's fine though. But yeah, with that, we'll move into what's probably our most interesting bug of the episode, in my opinion, which is a macOS named Vuln called Shrootless from Microsoft. The first half of the post goes into background on what exactly system integrity protection or SIP is, and some of the cases, like special cases that it has to handle. For those not familiar, SIP is like a last line of defense to prevent even someone who has root from doing super sensitive actions like loading loading untrusted kernel extensions, having write access to restricted file system locations, things like that. And it can't be turned off without rebooting into recovery mode. So, particularly, the file system stuff is what's focused on here. Basically, in the system library sandbox, there's a rootless.conf file that controls what files are protected by SIP, and that file in and of itself is SIP protected. So, any SIP protected files will have an extended attribute on them of this com.apple.rootless attribute. What's tricky though is Apple has to be able to get around SIP for their own system updates and such, or else they wouldn't be able to overwrite and update critical system files. Obviously, expecting someone to reboot into recovery mode, turn off SIP, reboot, update, reboot, go into recovery mode, turn it back on, and it's not really a reasonable update process for a user. So they added this entitlement or special permission to their updater process that allows them to bypass SIP checks. As you can imagine, any applications or services that have an entitlement, that have this entitlement, are a really interesting attack surface for attackers. Shrootless is based on the idea that the system install D daemon has a powerful entitlement called com.apple.rootless.install.inheritable, which not only makes it so that the install D daemon is able to bypass SIP, but any child processes it spawns can also bypass SIP as well. And this can be a problem because it's possible for Apple signed packages to have post install scripts, for example, which system install D will run using the default shell, ZSH. And when ZSH is started, it will look for the etc ZSH file, and if it exists, it'll run commands from that file automatically. So if you can control that file as an attacker, which you can place malicious commands in it and install an Apple signed package with post install scripts to trigger that and get your malicious commands ran. So yeah, kind of a cool way of taking advantage of the way various systems are designed to bypass SIP. Um, not a super technical bypass here. It's just, the fact, like, they really hammer home on the ZSHN file and how dangerous that can be. Um, because, like, I'll point out towards the end, it's not really super relevant to this attack specifically, but they mentioned that, like, ZSHN is just a very powerful primitive and could be used for other types of attacks due to the fact that it doesn't require root to write to. So, for instance, it could also be used as a persistence mechanism. Or as an elevation of privilege, because the home directory doesn't change when a user sudos, and that ZSHN file will be used again when a root shell is spawned. So by placing your own commands in there, when a user sudos and a new shell is created in the root context, those commands will be ran as root. So both of those were also reported to Apple as well. But yeah, I mean, just a very cool bypass that relies on um, a edge case that just wasn't really thought of by Apple when they were implementing SIP and had to account for their update system. So
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice, deep issue that just exists on like the edge cases, I guess, of what they're expecting. I mean, it's just classic, attacker mindset sort of thing. What can I do
yeah,
with this little bit of access that we have? And how do you break the system? I mean, and well written up here too. Oh,
as you'd
I
expect from
mean, it's
Microsoft.
yeah. I mean, I feel like there isn't really much to add on to that. I mean, serious issue, well explained, and something any of us, had we looked for, probably could have found. But of course, Microsoft were the ones that actually went and did that. Um, but I mean, just looking at those permissions, like it's a common enough attack surface for uh there to be like, because this does kind of come down to a permission issue. Had Etsy ZSH environment not have been something that everybody could write to, but had it been root restricted or even some other restriction on there, would have limited the attack surface quite a bit. But the fact that that existed plus this, great chain all around. I really don't have much to add on to it.
So I guess something I'll add on is some people who are reading this might be surprised that Microsoft has this like detailed report on uh on a macOS issue. I mean, for a long time, Microsoft and Apple were kind of, oil and water. And I thought I'd point out for those not aware, like, there has been a growing collaboration, or like, Microsoft's just trying to be more friendly, I guess, towards, Apple and open source, because they've been doing more stuff with Linux too. But um, they've been working to bring, or I think they have already brought actually, Defender to macOS, like Windows Defender, but now it's Microsoft 365 Defender. So Microsoft's just been kind of on this initiative to push more into, you know, protecting more than just Windows products. So that's why you're kind of seeing this research come into Microsoft here, and there probably will be more going into the future. So
Yeah, I mean, this actually, not sure if you're looking at the browser right now, but actually, this was reported by the Defender research.
Yeah, yeah, it was. But yeah, not really much to add there. Like you were saying, it's just a cool bypass, well written up, and yeah, and it's cool to see Microsoft, expanding a little bit beyond just Windows.
Well, they're
That's
attacking their enemies.
there you go. Yeah, that's the more cynical view on it. So yeah, that's pretty much all the topics that we had. We do have a shout out. Z, I'll let you cover the shout out that you had, and then we'll move to wrapping up the show.
Yeah, just a quick shout out for anybody trying to do like the bug bounties and stuff. Android security checklist, specifically on WebView, is just basically just a bunch of attacks that if you encounter an app uses a WebView within it, that's a little embedded browser. Things you can look for, common issues. Yeah, it's just kind of laying out some of those attacks. We're not going to cover all of them on here, but worth checking out if that's an area of interest to you. I mean, you're likely to find these sorts of issues in Android apps, so definitely claim some bounties on that.
All right, cool. So with that said, we'll wrap up the show. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. You can catch the VOD on Twitch or on YouTube at 6 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. We also have previous podcasts up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, more links on Anchor. If you want to join our Discord and follow us on Twitter, links for those are down below or in the chat. We'll be back tomorrow for the binary episode at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, which is where we'll also cover the Spot the Vuln solution that was shown in the pre-stream. We also have that in the Discord as well for those who missed it. And yeah, with all that said, we'll see you all tomorrow.